All right, fellas. Thank you for joining the Body Lock. This is Ant Walker, joined by Mike Fiedel and Pat Auger, two esteemed colleagues of mine. So, gentlemen, let's go ahead and jump right into these topics. We have some new developments as far as travel is concerned throughout the COVID-19 pandemic as it relates to the sport of mixed martial arts. The Department of Homeland Security has issued an exemption allowing foreign travel for athletes. So this obviously is very good news for the sports world, in particular mixed martial arts, considering so many fighters come from other countries outside of the U.S. or even North America, period. So let's get into our reactions to this, how this affects some of the other news, in particular Fight Island, that we keep hearing about, that we keep having to talk about. So Mike, if you wouldn't mind just kind of gracing the good folks as far as some of the legalese is concerned involved with the DHS's orders.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very important order for the sporting world. And as you said, the mixed martial arts world in particular. If you look at other sports, like, for example, the NHL, where 75% of the league is non-American, the NBA and I believe MLB are sitting around 25%. MMA is one of those sports. We have fighters and champions from all over the globe, and it's a very important thing to have these fighters represented. Now, the UFC knows this, but they also know that that's not possible right now. With travel restrictions, both with the US and other countries, it was impossible for a lot of fighters to come to the United States and compete. We see that, for example, with Khabib Nurmagomedov, who was not able to leave Russia for UFC 249 and come to the United States on a direct flight. Now, with this order from the DHS, which was brought into place on May 22nd, the country will be exempting foreign athletes from these restrictions. What that means is essentially if you play for a professional sporting league or the UFC in this case, you will be allowed to travel to the United States with the blessing of the US government and still subject to all of the restrictions that apply as someone traveling to the United States right now. In order to compete. Now, we know that President Trump and the current administration have been very vocal about wanting sports to resume and to reopen the country. So this is much in line with that thinking. And what this means for the UFC specifically is that fighters who normally could not get into the US, specifically fighters like Jose Aldo, who had visa issues stop him from fighting Henry Cejudo at the reprogrammed and rescheduled UFC 249 event, may be able to go. Now, it's an important distinction that just because the U.S. allows entry to foreign athletes doesn't mean that process will be streamlined. That order does not speak necessarily to the visa process, as managers like Daniel Rubenstein and Alex Davis pointed out on Twitter. There's still holdups in visa and immigration issues, largely due to COVID-19, but also due to those systems in and of themselves. So we should see more foreign athletes be able to come to the U.S., but if not, there is always Fight Island, which was created for the same reason. So with that, back to you guys.
All right. So you mentioned Fight Island. Now, Pat, let me get your take on this. Now, the first thing I thought when this order was released, does Fight Island even really matter anymore? Is it necessary thing to pursue this island strictly for UFC events to take place?
I don't think that I think it still matters, but not in the way that it did. I think from a marketing perspective, I think people have eaten this up. I think people love the idea of Fight Island, the whole, let's go to a secret island and have fights like Bloodsport. I think people really bought into that. And from a marketing perspective, it doesn't make sense not to do it. I think also, despite the travel restrictions being lifted on the US side, there's also several countries that still have their own travel restrictions where maybe someone could possibly leave to go to the US, but they might not be able to get back. Because of that, I think you still need, for some of those countries, a separate international place to hold events. And again, Fight Island seems to be the place to go. I think it's also interesting that in that exemption that was signed by the government, they list out the sports that are included in this. They say, covered, including Major League Baseball, National Basketball Association, and so on and so forth through the list. But UFC is nowhere to be found on that. I'm not sure why that's the case, especially given, Dana White is part of Trump's advisory committee on reopening sports and doing that. But I wonder if there isn't some specific reason it was left out when you have every other major league of any kind pretty much listed in that capacity. So again, I don't think it's necessary in the same way it was for a lot of events, but if you're getting particular fighters from a country where they might not be able to go back home if they go to the US, or there's particular, quarantine things, for example, England, I know if you're traveling back to England, you have to do 14 mandatory days quarantine, at least from the US, I think from several other countries as well. I think going to a place like Fight Island circumvents those procedures. And again, marketing is king. I don't know at this point how you wouldn't hold it just to, get that boost in revenue from marketing.
Just really quickly, speaking about why the UFC was not included in the order by name, I spoke to noted sports attorney Dan Lust about this, and he advised me that the order specifically notes that these are leagues that are preparing to return back to action, whereas the UFC has been in action. So I believe that will not affect anything. Lutz said that he doesn't see that as being detrimental to the UFC's ability to get fighters in the country, more so that it was geared towards sports that are reopening as an incentive for them and as a insurance for them, rather than a direct omission of the UFC with a purpose, so to speak.
Interesting. I at the very least, I'd imagine that would have been the slightest of oversights. Especially considering the direct line that Dana White has into the White House. And obviously now with Nevada approving the UFC to come back into action in their state, Florida already setting a precedent there as well, that with state government support, I'd imagine the federal government wouldn't be very far behind in lending its support to mixed martial arts returning, at least for the UFC, because of their direct company line to the White House. Now, I'm kind of conflicted on this Fight Island thing. The marketing of it has been absolutely fantastic. I mean, they're selling Fight Island T-shirts. This is a constant joke on MMA Twitter. It's something that we can't stop talking about for obvious reasons. I mean, it's such a ridiculous idea. It's so wacky that you almost want to see it happen just to say you were there to watch it happen. It's kind of one of those bucket list sort of things. But now my idea for Fight Island might be a little different here. I do think that Fight Island now with the marketing behind it, yes, go ahead, go forward with it. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference as far as the athletes are concerned. Now, if you can get the athletes out of their countries, yeah, they can pretty much go anywhere. With this travel exemption, and either way, whether they were at an island that was in international waters, or if they were coming into the mainland U.S., they still would be subject to some sort of quarantine restrictions on their own country, just because they did leave those borders. So I don't think that's going to make much of a difference for a lot of the roster as far as the specific COVID-19 related planning. But I do think the idea of Fight Island will be better executed with more time. The Athletic Commission has already approved the Apex Center being the place for UFC events to occur now. I say table Fight Island. Table it. Keep building that infrastructure. Make that infrastructure better. I would propose going full on into the ridiculous, full on into the Enter the Dragon sort of mystique here. Make it a VIP experience. Once a year, take a month out of the UFC schedule and just run a few events there. An all-inclusive vacation package. Your high rollers can stay there at the hotels. They can attend sort of fan events and whatnot. And there you have it. You have Fight Island. You broadcast it to the world. You get the backdrop. You get that sort of a sort of like Lionheart vibe of the rich guys betting, standing outside the pool as Van Damme like spin kick someone in the face. Why not? We've already gone so far into the ridiculous. Let's just dive in head first.
Yeah, I agree. For me, Fight Island is fine. If you're going to do it, do it. I would have, preferred that money goes more towards the fighters. But if it's going towards Fight Island already, I don't see any harm in having Fight Island. One thing that is important to note about this exemption is even though the exemption allows for foreign individuals to come to the United States, regardless of the U.S. travel restrictions on that country, Brazil being an important one that was recently issued, we don't know how the process will work for athletes as far as visas. And like you said, travel to the US from their home country or travel back from the US. So for those fighters, if something can't be worked out with the DHS order, Fight Island might still be the only way for them to fight. So Fight Island started as a backup plan, and it still is a backup plan.
Yeah, and I got to say, I disagree a little bit with that there about giving it more time, just because if stuff starts reopening and you start getting back to normal and, second wave or peak or not, if basically the U.S. says, you know what, we're just going to reopen and that's that, and goes that route, I think that you're going to get a bit of mystique taken away from it, right? Like right now they have a reason to do Fight Island. If you reopen the entire country, yes, there's still issues. Yes, they're still going to have to adhere to certain rules, but I think it takes a little bit away from it. I think you strike while the iron's hot. I think you go for Fight Island as soon as possible, eat up that revenue, and then you bring it back every year. Then do the VIP experience. That's what I would think.
Yeah, fair point. It's just that we still won't have audiences. There still won't be anybody there. So at the very least, there's a mystique around attending an event. I mean, realistically, we're looking at the country reopening, but there's still, for obvious reasons, a big sad face attached to anybody who wants to gather en masse at a sporting event. You know, the idea of packing 15,000 people into an arena right now to watch a cage fight just sounds reckless, to say the least. So Fight Island would at least have that. If you are rich enough, if you are that much of a fan, if you're the guy who has too much money so that he decides he wants to order that UFC branded hot dog brander, hey, Fight Island might be the thing for you. It just might be the spot. So we'll see. We'll see.